Ever find yourself looking at a painting or listening to some music and just thinking like, what is this thing, really?
Yeah.
For a mind like yours, I bet you've probably spent some time considering the very nature of art.
Quite a bit, actually.
Well, you sent over some really interesting stuff from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy about the ontology of art. Mm-hmm. And it looks like philosophers have been trying to figure this out for centuries.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right in and see what some of the brightest minds have come up with about, the being of art.
Yeah, that's exactly it. This is more than just enjoying pretty things. It's really about existence.
Yeah.
This very fundamental philosophical question of existence, but applied to art.
Right.
To artistic creation.
Okay.
So we are going deep on this one.
Right.
We are diving deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry, History of the Ontology of Art.
Wow.
And really our mission for you, our fellow philosopher, is to understand the debates about the nature of art and see what kind of answers people have come up with to the question of what art is.
All right, so let's get into this. And we're not just going to survey all the different ideas out there.
No.
We want to get to the heart of the matter.
Absolutely.
Those moments of insight where different arguments clash or maybe even come together.
Right.
So we're talking about the very being of art.
Oh.
And that means we need to start with a question.
Okay.
It might seem a little strange at first, but I think you'll appreciate it because, you're a philosopher.
Yeah.
And you like to question assumptions.
Yeah.
So, do works of art actually exist?
It seems kind of ridiculous, right?
It does.
I mean, we see paintings, we hear music, we read novels.
Yeah.
So how can we even ask that question?
Right.
But as you said, brilliant philosophers, the best minds, some of them have wondered whether these things, the things we call art, really exist, or at least in what way they exist.
Right, yeah.
And the thing is, it's not that anyone's denying that we experience art. It's more about trying to understand what it even means for a work of art to exist.
Okay, that makes sense. So one of the first things the entry talks about is realism.
Yeah.
This idea that art just is. It's real.
Right.
It doesn't matter what we think about it or how we feel about it. It exists on its own. It's like saying that the value and meaning of art is objective, not something we just make up in our heads.
It's a good place to start.
Yeah.
And there's a really clear example of this from Samuel Alexander, who said that Shakespeare basically discovered Hamlet in the English language. Like it was always there, waiting to be found.
Interesting.
And then you have Monroe Beardsley, who was a big defender of realism. He thought a work of art was either a specific physical thing, like a sculpture, or a kind of physical thing, like an etching, which can have many copies.
Yeah, right. So for realists, art's very much grounded in the physical world.
Exactly.
But then things get more complicated.
Of course they do.
Because some philosophers say, no, art has these modes of being. Like it's more than just existing physically.
Right. It's like they're saying art is on another level of reality.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a bit like trying to map out reality, but specifically for art.
Okay.
Like, where does art fit in the big scheme of things? So you have someone like C.E.M. Joad. He struggled with how to think about plays like Hamlet, because a play isn't just the script or a performance or even every single reading of the play.
Right.
So his answer was that art exists as something called a subsistent object.
Okay, a subsistent object. What's that?
It's this idea of something that's not just in your mind, but not really material either. It's like a universal truth.
So it's like it has its own being.
Exactly, like a mathematical concept existing outside of time and space.
Like a Platonic form.
Very much so.
Okay.
Then you have philosophers like Etienne Gilson and Etienne Sérieux who had this more pluralistic view.
Pluralistic.
Yeah, they thought art could exist in many ways. So Gilson, for example, made a distinction between the physical art object itself, how it's experienced aesthetically, and how it exists as something the artist created with a purpose.
Right. That makes sense.
And Sérieux, he had this idea of art existing as a thing aesthetically and then also transcendentally.
Transcendentally.
Yeah.
Okay.
So all these philosophers are grappling with the fact that art has many sides.
Yeah.
It's physical. It impacts us emotionally and intellectually.
Right.
And maybe it's something even more fundamental than that.
Right. So it's not just a thing. It's an experience and a creation and maybe something even deeper. And this leads us to, the role of imagination.
Absolutely.
It's not just about the artist needing imagination to create art.
Right.
Some philosophers are saying that imagination is part of what art is.
Right. It's this bridge between the actual object, like the paint on the canvas, and us seeing it as art.
Yeah.
And that has some big implications for whether art is objective.
Okay, so how does imagination play into all this?
Well, it's been a big theme in aesthetics for a long time. Back in the 18th century, thinkers like Addison and Kant were already talking about how important imagination is for how we respond to art.
Right.
But then in the 19th and 20th centuries, philosophers like Vischer and Zimmermann and Volkelt took this further. They argued that imagination isn't passive.
Okay.
It's not just us receiving something. It's an active force in how art is created and how we experience it.
That's interesting. So are they saying that we're kind of co-creating the art with the artist through our imaginations?
In a way, yes. And this is where someone like Edward von Hartmann comes in, who really challenged the straightforward, realist view of art.
Okay, tell me about von Hartmann.
He said beauty isn't actually in the object itself, like its shape or color. It's something that appears to us subjectively.
So it's more like how we feel when we taste something sweet.
Exactly. It's a subjective experience.
Right.
So when we look at a painting and say, this is beautiful, we're not saying the canvas itself is beautiful objectively. We're saying it has the potential to create this feeling of beauty in us. This he called fantasy work. It's what the artist creates in our minds.
Interesting.
And this fantasy work, it's not just an idea. It's tied to the specific materials the artist used.
Okay, so the medium really matters for von Hartmann.
Absolutely. It's all part of how the artist brings that imagined work to life.
That makes sense.
Then you have Conrad von Lange, who came up with this idea of conscious self-deception in art.
Conscious self-deception.
Yeah, it sounds a bit strange.
She does.
But he meant that when we create art and when we experience it, we're kind of playing with illusion.
Okay.
We know it's not real in the everyday sense, but we choose to believe in it, to get lost in it.
So art's like a game of make-believe.
Exactly. And that idea really connects with Kendall Walton's work on make-believe much later on.
Right.
They both saw art as this space where we willingly suspend disbelief.
And, of course, we can't forget about Sartre, who famously said that Beethoven's Seventh Symphony exists outside of the real.
Right, a very provocative statement.
He's basically saying that we don't really hear the symphony as a physical thing. We're recreating it in our minds as we listen.
It's almost like he's doubting that music has any real independent existence apart from our minds.
Yeah, that's a pretty radical idea.
It is. And it's important to remember that both Ingarden and Nikolai Hartmann, who Sartre was familiar with, also believed that imagination was key to understanding art. They saw artworks as having layers, and imagination was how we access those deeper layers.
So tell me more about Nikolai Hartmann's view. He seems to have a really interesting take on this.
Yeah, he was a very nuanced thinker. He thought art is essentially fiction, made up of at least two layers. The foreground, which is what we actually see and hear, like the paint on the canvas or the sound of the music.
Okay.
And then there's the background, which we can only understand through our imagination.
So the background is like the meaning behind the work, the artist's intention.
Exactly. It's what makes the work more than just a physical object. And for Hartmann, because art needs our imagination to be complete, it doesn't exist independently.
It doesn't have what he called Ansichtsein.
Exactly. It's more like an appearance experienced as appearance.
So we're not being tricked.
No, not exactly.
Yeah.
It's more like we're actively participating in a kind of illusion.
Okay, that makes sense. And didn't Stephen Pepper have some interesting things to say about imagination and art?
Oh, absolutely. He talked about how our imagination transforms a physical work of art into an aesthetic one, though his views lean towards a more relative understanding of art rather than seeing it strictly as fiction.
Relative.
Yeah, like the meaning and value of art depends on the individual and their context.
Right.
And then there's Joseph Margolis.
Yeah.
He thought a work of art has two parts, the physical thing and the aesthetic design that's on top of that. We need our imagination to access and understand that aesthetic design. He even suggested that because of this imaginative element, maybe the rules of logic don't apply to art in the same way they do to other things.
That's pretty radical.
It is.
So Margolis thought that a work of art kind of comes in and out of existence depending on whether someone's paying attention to it and using their imagination.
Exactly. He called it intermittence.
Intermittent.
Like it's flickering on and off.
So for him, if no one's looking at the Mona Lisa and thinking about it aesthetically, it doesn't exist as art.
Well, that's a very controversial idea.
It is.
And lots of philosophers disagree.
Right.
Volkelt, for example, argued that even when the statue of Zeus was buried and no one could see it, it was still a work of art.
Makes sense.
And Wolterstorff later asked, Do Beethoven's quartets stop existing when no one's listening to them?
Yeah, that's a good question.
So this discomfort with the idea of intermittence led some philosophers to look for other ways to think about the being of art.
Okay, so they were looking for ways to make the existence of art more stable, more continuous.
Exactly. They came up with ideas like Ushenko's latent powers or Pepper's double dispositional account.
Okay.
These ideas focus on the potential of art to be experienced even when it's not actively being perceived.
Right.
So the art is still there even if no one's engaging with it at that moment.
Okay, so we've talked about realism, those different modes of being, and how imagination might be fundamental to art.
Right.
Now, let's shift gears and dive into idealism.
Okay.
This is where the mind becomes the central player in the story of art.
Right, because for idealists, the mind and art are very closely connected.
Yeah.
They say that art wouldn't exist without mental activity.
Okay.
One of the most famous idealists was Benedetto Croce. He was very radical.
Okay.
He said that real art can't be a physical object.
Really?
Yeah, because he thought true art is an expression of intuition.
Intuition.
Yeah, like a pure, immediate understanding.
Yep.
And he believed that this kind of intuition, it's the most real thing there is. More real than the physical world.
Wow, that's a big claim.
It is. It completely flips our usual way of thinking about things.
Right. Normally we think the physical world is what's real and ideas are secondary.
Exactly.
So for Croce, the physical artwork is just a representation of something deeper, something mental.
Exactly. It's like a shadow of the real thing, which is the artist's intuition.
Okay, and then there's Waldemar Conrad, who is influenced by Husserl's ideas about phenomenology.
Right.
He argued that we need to have a special kind of awareness, a phenomenological attitude to really grasp the ideal object of art.
Yeah.
So like with the symphony, the ideal object is the symphony itself.
Yes.
Not any particular performance of it.
Right, because a performance is just an event in time and space. But the symphony itself, it's something more enduring.
So for Conrad, the true essence of art is something we access through our conscious experience.
Exactly. It's about how our minds engage with the work. And, you know, Conrad was very concerned with making sure that art wasn't just reduced to subjective feeling.
Right, because that would make it very objective.
Exactly. So he tried to find a way to ground art in something more solid, even if it's still in the realm of ideas.
Right. And Croce's idea about art being an expression of intuition was really influential.
Oh, absolutely. He really put ontological questions about art on the map. His ideas were developed further by his followers in Britain, people like Abercrombie and Leon.
Right.
They took this idea of art as an expression and ran with it.
Interesting.
Abercrombie, he mainly saw art as an experience. And Leon described art as a quality that is uniquely experienced.
Right, so they were both really focused on the subjective experience of art.
Yeah, exactly. They were interested in how art makes us feel, how it affects our consciousness.
Okay.
Then there was George Beiswanger, who brought together ideas from Plato, Romanticism, and even John Dewey.
Wow, that's quite a mix.
It is. But it shows how these ideas about art and the mind were developing. Beiswanger believed that the actual physical artwork is just a tool.
Okay.
It's a tool to evoke something else, something he called experienced experiencing.
Experienced experiencing.
Yeah.
It's like a heightened state of consciousness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the real aesthetic object, and the physical artwork just helps us get there.
Interesting.
And, of course, we can't talk about idealism without mentioning R.G. Collingwood.
Yeah, Collingwood. He was a big name in aesthetics.
He really made Croce's ideas more accessible. And he agreed that art isn't just a physical object, it's an activity, a conscious, imaginative activity of expression.
Right, so the art is the creative process itself.
Exactly. But for Collingwood, that didn't mean art is any less real.
Okay.
In fact, he thought it made it even more real because it's happening in the very core of who we are, in our consciousness.
Right, it's part of what makes us human. Okay, but the entry also points out that there are some pretty strong arguments against theories that just equate art with our experiences.
Right, because there are some problems.
So what are some of the issues with equating art with our experiences?
Well, one big critique is that it's easy to mix up the experience of something with the thing itself.
Right, so just because I experience a painting as beautiful doesn't mean that the painting is my experience.
Exactly. And those experience-based theories, they often don't pay enough attention to the actual physical stuff of art.
The paint, the canvas, the notes.
Exactly. And it can lead to some weird conclusions, like saying that something public and shared, like a famous artwork, is just a private thought in someone's head.
Right, that doesn't seem quite right.
It doesn't. And philosophers like Alexander and Reid, they pointed out these issues with Croce's ideas early on. And more recently, Levinson has criticized Scruton's philosophy of music for having similar problems.
Okay, so it sounds like these experience-based theories have some holes.
They do?
But didn't Bolzano have slightly different kind of idealism?
Yeah, he was a bit of an outlier.
How so?
Well, he distinguished between arts that engage our senses and arts that happen purely in our minds.
Okay.
He thought the second kind, the purely mental arts, create works of ideas, and these ideas are mainly for the person who thought them up.
Like internal works of art.
Exactly. But he also thought it's kind of imperfect that we have to externalize these internal works to make art that we can actually experience with our senses.
Right, because for him, the purest form of art is in the mind.
Exactly.
So even within idealism, there are different ideas about what art really is.
Yeah. It's a rich and complex tradition.
And then there's elimination.
Oh, yeah, elimination.
The idea that maybe we should just get rid of the whole idea of work of art altogether.
It's a bold move.
It is. It really challenges our everyday thinking about art.
For sure. So for some philosophers who like to keep their ideas about what exists very simple, the whole category of work of art seems kind of unnecessary, even problematic. Richard Redner, for example, argued that when we talk about works of art, we're not actually referring to anything real.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, he thought those terms are just part of our language about art, but they don't point to actual things out there in the world.
So they're like placeholders.
Exactly. And he even doubted whether science could ever really understand what we're responding to when we have an aesthetic experience.
Wow, that's pretty skeptical.
It is. Then you have Roland Barthes, who famously argued that the concept of a work is tied to this repressive ideology.
Repressive?
Yeah, like it's trying to control meaning and ownership of art. He preferred the idea of textuality, which is more open-ended and allows for multiple interpretations.
So he was all about freedom and flexibility and how we understand art.
Absolutely. He wanted to get away from the idea that a work has one fixed meaning that comes from the artist.
Right.
Stephen David Ross went even further and argued that there's no single work of art. He thought we should focus on the various achievements that come from the creative process.
So for him, it's more about the act of creating, not the end product.
Exactly. And Anders Pettersson took an even more extreme eliminativist stance.
How so?
Well, he argued that the idea of a literary work is actually self-contradictory and just creates confusion in literary theory. He thought we can talk about literature without needing this idea of fixed texts or works.
Okay.
And more recently, Ross Cameron has said that while the things we say about art in everyday life can be true, art itself might not be this fundamental thing that needs to be part of our basic understanding of reality.
So he's saying that we can talk about art without needing to have a grand theory about what it is.
Exactly. Though, of course, not everyone agrees with this eliminativist view.
Right, because it seems to go against our common sense and the ways we usually talk about art.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've explored all sorts of different answers to the question of what art is. Now, the deep dive gets into whether there's one category that all art belongs to.
Right.
This is the debate between monism and its rivals.
Yeah.
It's asking whether there's one kind of thing that all artworks are.
So monism basically means that all art, no matter what form it takes, can be put into one big ontological box.
Okay.
Like maybe they're all abstract objects,
Right.
but a lot of people push back against monism.
Why is that?
Well, they point out that there are big differences between art forms that involve performance, like music and theater, and those that don't, like painting.
Right.
With performance art, you have multiple performances of the same work. But with a painting, you only have the one unique object.
That's true.
And as Wolterstorff said, works of art are not all alike in their ontological status.
That seems fair.
Yeah, and Stephen Davies and Robert Howell also argue against monism. They say that art is just too diverse.
Right.
You have everything from improvised music to carefully crafted sculptures.
Yeah.
It's hard to see how you could fit all that into one category.
And Sherry Irvin adds that the artist has the right to define what their work is.
Right.
So trying to force all art into one box is either going to be wrong or way too general.
Exactly. You're going to miss a lot of the nuances.
Okay, so a big part of this debate about Maoridism is whether an artwork can have multiple instances or if it's always unique.
Right. That's a key question.
Because some art, like photos and music recordings, can be copied.
Yeah.
Which seems to imply that the work isn't just the original object.
Right, and this is the distinction between multiple versus singular art items.
Okay.
So it feels kind of wrong to say that Cartier-Bresson's famous photo is just the original negative.
Yeah, or any single print made from it.
Exactly. And works that are meant to be copied, they seem like a different kind of thing than artworks that are inherently one of a kind. But some philosophers argue that this idea of copying, it's just a product of technology.
Okay.
And it might not tell us anything fundamental about the nature of art.
Right, so in the past, before easy copying, maybe this wasn't such a big issue.
Exactly. It's a relatively recent phenomenon in the grand scheme of things.
This reminds me of Walter Benjamin's essay about mechanical reproduction.
Ah, yes, a classic.
He argued that the ability to easily copy art actually changes our relationship with it.
Right.
And maybe even the nature of the art itself.
Yeah. He thought that mass production takes away the unique aura of an original artwork.
Wow.
He meant its authenticity, its connection to history, its specialness.
Right, because if anyone can have a copy, it doesn't feel as special.
Exactly.
And he was worried about the social and political effects of that.
Right.
It's like art becomes less powerful, less meaningful.
It loses some of its magic. Though it's important to remember that Benjamin also recognized that people have always been able to make copies.
True.
Even before machines.
Right.
So in a way, it's always been an issue.
So where does C.I. Lewis fit into all this?
Well, he talked about something called aesthetic essence.
Aesthetic essence.
Yeah, it's like a particular configuration of qualities that we experience when we engage with art. He said that art always needs some physical form to exist, whether that's a painting or a musical performance.
Okay.
But the way that art depends on its physical form, it varies depending on the type of art.
Okay, so give me an example.
So take a poem. For Lewis, a poem is like an abstract essence that can be realized in different ways, like printed words or spoken words.
All right.
And in theory, it could be repeated across many different instances.
Okay.
But the important thing for Lewis is that we always experience this aesthetic essence through a specific context.
Right, so the physical object, the performance, the historical setting, all of that matters.
Exactly. He thought we need that context to understand the art properly.
Okay.
He even suggested that, in principle, any aesthetic essence could be embodied by a different physical thing.
So like the same poem could be written in different languages or set to music.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for him, this abstract core of the art is what matters most.
And this idea of multiple instances of a work of art, it was picked up by other philosophers too.
Oh, yeah. Thinkers like Ushenko, Strawson, Saville, and Curry.
Right.
They all explored this idea in different ways.
Okay. But what about the philosophers who emphasize the singularity of artworks?
Right. There's a whole other side to this debate.
So they're saying that some art is inherently unique.
Exactly. And there are lots of them. Croce, Ingarden, Goodman, Wollheim, Levinson, to name a few.
Okay, so what are their arguments for the singularity of art?
Well, Ingarden, for instance, hated the idea of making perfect replicas of something like Notre Dame Cathedral. He felt like such a work of art has a unique identity that just can't be copied.
Okay, so it's not just about the physical structure, it's about something more.
Exactly. It's about its history, its context, its very being.
Right, you can't just recreate that.
Exactly. And then you have O'Hear, who argued for a singularity thesis, but only for works of art that we consider really important.
So like masterpieces.
Exactly. Works that have a lot of aesthetic and cultural significance.
Okay.
And Wang argued that it often comes down to the artist's intentions.
Okay.
Whether they intended their work to be reproducible or to remain unique.
Right, so if an artist created a performance that was meant to be ephemeral, then that's part of the work's identity.
Exactly. You can't just record it and say it's the same thing.
Makes sense.
And Oldersdorff added that for some artworks, especially paintings, the artist doesn't even specify what would count as a correct copy.
So there's no way to know for sure what a faithful reproduction would even look like.
Right. And Jeanette saw the whole idea of reproducibility as something that's often decided by institutions.
Okay, like museums and galleries.
Exactly.
Yep.
It's not something inherent to the artwork itself.
That's an interesting perspective. And didn't Sibley have some interesting thoughts about this, particularly in relation to the Mona Lisa?
Oh, absolutely. He talked about a kind of two-directional pull when it comes to visual art like that.
Two-directional pull.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like the Mona Lisa is both a unique object that can't be replaced.
Right.
And something that can be functionally copied, even if the copy will never be the same as the original.
Right, because the copy can still look very similar.
Exactly. So it's this strange duality.
Okay, this all leads us to another important distinction in art ontology. The difference between the artistic vehicle and the work of art itself.
Right, because sometimes when we talk about a work of art, we could be talking about the physical thing, like the painting. Or we could be talking about something more abstract that it represents or expresses.
Right, so there's this ambiguity in how we use the term.
Exactly. And that has led to a lot of philosophical debate.
Okay.
Some philosophers, like Aldrich, actually thought this ambiguity is useful because it lets us talk about art in different ways.
Right.
But others, like Boas, worried that it leads to confusion.
Right.
Like, we might mix up the process of creating art with the finished product.
That makes sense.
And Richardson Sparshott also pointed out that we use the term work of art in so many different ways, it's hard to say what it really means.
Right, so maybe there's no one right answer to the question, what is a work of art?
Well, Thomason argued that the way we categorize artworks is inherently